Alright guys, so welcome. This is chapter 56, part 1, and chapter 56 really kind of goes into looking at ecology, but now from a conservation standpoint, and what sort of things are threatening our health of our global ecosystems, and kind of what we're trying to do to help that, from studying just what's happening to ways that we can manage our impact on the globe. So, the first section of chapter 56 really talks about biodiversity. And ecologists are really putting out there this idea that we're really in a biodiversity crisis. All right, at this point, we believe we've named and described approximately 1.8 million species, but we're estimating that there's anywhere from 10 to 100 million species that exist on Earth. All right, so what we actually know to exist and to have named and to have described as a scientific community is only a small fraction of what we believe to actually be out there. And the biggest concentrations of these organisms are in our biodiversity hotspots, your tropical rainforests, your coral reefs. And yet those are the areas that have the greatest number of species and yet are also being destroyed at probably the highest rate. And what we're coming to realize is that a lot of our human activity is rapidly pushing these species towards extinction, and we're causing species to go extinct that we don't even know exist, at least in the standpoint of having studied them and described them and named them. All right, and that's sort of a scary place to be in. So, conservation biology is really taking all of these different levels of biological study and kind of integrating them in a way to conserve this biodiversity at every level possible. So, when we're talking about conservation biology, although it gets talked about with ecology, it's got hints of evolutionary biology, physiology, molecular biology, which is where you're talking about things like metabolism, protein synthesis, your genetics is in there, behavioral science. So, although it's ecology based, it's certainly pulling in scientists from all different specialities, because we're trying to conserve things that aren't just one-sided. All right, the conservation effort has to be multifaceted in order for this to really work. So, our human activity, all right, more than anything else that we've been able to measure in Earth's history, is really threatening the rate of extinction, the biodiversity crisis, if you will. And we can see that our current rate is high, and it's largely a result of the patchiness that we're creating in our ecosystems by the activities that we're doing. Putting in roads, putting in developments, putting in business complexes, and all that kind of stuff is really chopping up the ecosystems that these species are used to developing, used to living in. Okay, and so we need to be aware of that and the impacts that that's having. And one of the biggest places that we're doing this to is our tropical rainforests. Okay, we know this to be terrestrially the biggest biodiversity hotspot on the globe, and yet we're going in and we're altering that hotspot in such an alarming rate by clear cutting, slashing, and burning, taking out all of these resources that these species depend on, to a point that we don't even know what species are there and what resources they need. All right, and so our activities aren't just causing harm to the species we do know about, but the ones that we don't. And so from a conservation standpoint, we can talk about things that we can do for the species we do understand and do know exist, but it gets increasingly more complex when you start throwing in, well, we know other species have to exist here, but we don't know what their needs are. We don't know what their mating habits are. And so how do you kind of conserve all of that when we don't even have all the information? And that really starts to make things more complex. So, although we can't necessarily have an action plan for every species out there, although that might be the ultimate goal, one thing we do understand, at least, is that if we're trying to conserve biodiversity, there's 3 different levels, or 3 major components that we have to take into consideration for any population, any species, just in general. And so biodiversity has these 3 major components. We can talk about it at the genetic level, at the diversity within the genes in a population or between populations. We can scale it up and talk about species diversity, so sort of looking more at a community level, and then ultimately going up even further and looking at the ecosystem diversity across an entire region, and how does that affect. So if we sort of give these different pieces of diversity their definition, if you will. All right, when we talk about genetic diversity, we're talking about the genes, the different types of genes that are within the population, as well as the movement of those genes between one population and the next. And this idea comes back up again in evolution, because we start talking about things like your founder effect, your bottleneck effects, and how cutting off different populations and that gene flow really can drive evolution. But if those populations don't have enough genetic diversity, we start having issues with inbreeding, and reducing that genetic diversity. Thus, there's not enough variation within a population or between populations in order to keep them going if some sort of change in their environment happens. And then we start worrying about extinction. From a species diversity standpoint, just what the variety of different species are in an ecosystem, and then ultimately throughout our biosphere as a whole. And if you remember from the earlier chapters, we talked a little bit about species richness versus sort of just the abundance of species. And remember, we said that the stability of a community structure is much better the more different species that you have, and the relative abundance being a little bit more equal within your population, rather than having sort of these monocultures or single hotbeds of certain species. All right, that interdependence on different organisms is very important. And then we can also talk about ecosystem diversity. So having those different environments for different species, and this is probably where human activity is affecting the most, but that human activity affecting that ecosystem diversity is trickling down into everything else. So part of this section ties in the idea of your endangered and threatened species. And ultimately, we're working to try and label the organisms we do know exist as one of these sort of categories, so that things like the Endangered Species Act can take over, and legally force us to ensure that we're conserving their environments. So if we talk about an endangered species, we're talking about one that is in serious danger of becoming extinct throughout its entire range. So whatever area of the globe they're supposed to be found in, they are definitely in very small numbers, and we're worried about extinction. We talk about a threatened species, all right, and there's enough indicators, both population size dropping, human activity moving into their environments, so on and so forth, that we consider it likely that they can, if nothing changes, be endangered in the foreseeable future. So the idea is to hopefully identify species as threatened and keep them from ever getting onto that actual endangered list. So globally, we're talking anywhere from about 12% of the birds, 21% of mammals, and alarmingly 32% of our amphibians that are threatened with extinction. Okay. And now these numbers can be considered endangered globally. All right, so across the globe, wherever we find these species, they're endangered. Or it can be simply just local. Okay. But even local extinction of a particular species, such as something like a keystone species or a foundational species, can have severe effects on that ecosystem. All right, and so the idea is to conserve everything in hopes of keeping just general collapse from happening. So even if we have a local extinction of one species, that collapse can have domino effects throughout its entire ecosystem. And then we've got individuals who are sort of part of this, what they're calling the 100 Heartbeat Club. And these are species that are so few in numbers, all right, that we believe that there's less than 100 individuals on Earth. All right, and they mention it as many as those heartbeats from extinction. So here we're getting to organisms that are so severely endangered that we really need to step up conservation efforts if we have any prayer of keeping them from going extinct. And a lot of these organisms are ones that are typically your zoo animals. All right, we've taken them into captivity hoping to at least preserve something. So why should we care? And what are some of the messages that might be useful, all right, to helping those who aren't necessarily science-minded, if you will? It's not necessarily their interest. How do we kind of get the global community of human beings to care? Because let's face it, in order to make these conservation efforts really work, it's going to take the entire globe to do it. All right. And so some of the things that are suggested, obviously, just to recognize that biodiversity is necessary for our own sake. All right. Just that to keep the globe functioning, biodiversity needs to be there. All right. And that in and of itself, probably not going to convince the mass populace. So some other ideas, that species diversity in and of itself has a lot of practical benefits for us. One thing that we know is a lot of pharmaceuticals, somewhere around 25% of what we utilize here in the US, contain substances that originally came from plants. And a lot of those plants were often found in things like your tropical rainforests. So trying to appeal to the masses in the terms that there may be medications, cures for diseases that we don't currently have medications or cures for. If we're chopping down our rainforest, we may never have the opportunity to find these plants that have these compounds that we can use for life-sustaining, life-surviving medications. All right, and so sort of trying to appeal to people that way. We also need it in our agriculture. All right, we are becoming more and more adept at utilizing genetic engineering, where we're splicing different traits from different organisms into something that we use commercially. And some of those genetic qualities are coming out of other plants that are in threat of disappearing, or there are traits in plants that we haven't discovered yet. So trying to utilize that for things like our agricultural crops, maybe the drought resistance, disease resistance, bigger yield, better crops, more guaranteed yield. If we get rid of these organisms, we never have the opportunity to get a hold of some of that genetic information. So, major threats. There's really four big things that we know if we continue doing at the rate we are, they're going to have major consequences because we're already seeing them. One of the biggest is just the habitat destruction. All right, but we can also include introduced species, which you may also kind of associate with invasives, the overharvesting, and then ultimately the global change. So our habitat destruction, we're talking about putting up our developments, putting up our business complexes, going in and logging out forests with sort of no regard for what we're taking and where we're taking it. And so this is probably the single greatest threat to biodiversity because it's happening so rampantly without really regard for what effects we're having when we do it. And so what we really end up doing is fragmenting a lot of our habitats into these small patches. And by doing that, not only are we taking the natural ranges that these species may need to survive and chopping them into little pieces, but we're also breaking them up and preventing organisms from being able to migrate between populations. All right, so we're isolating different populations, which then ties back into that genetic idea and forcing more and more inbreeding rather than having flow of genetic material between populations. So just some of the statistics, all right, that your text goes into. Prairies in Wisconsin occupy less than 0.1% of the original area they did. All right, if you were to kind of map that on a map of Wisconsin, it's dramatic how much we have chopped and developed those prairie areas, and that's a big deal for the species who live there. Somewhere around 93%. It's a high number. Of coral reefs are being damaged because of the activities we're doing. Things we're dumping into the oceans, climate change. All right, and here again, our biggest aquatic diversity hotspot, and it's getting destroyed at very alarming rates. Our introduced species. Okay, these are species that we as humans move from sort of their native original locations into new geographic areas. And these can be things that we move on purpose. We do this a lot with ornamental plants that we grow in our landscaping. All right, or they kind of be by accident. Biggest one you're probably familiar with is our lovely stink bugs. Okay, the fact that we are shipping things across the globe. Stink bugs happen to end up in a shipping crate from China and ended up getting released when we opened the shipping crate here in the US. All right, and it wasn't anything people were intending to do, but we need to be conscious of when we ship things across the globe, what else is getting shipped along with that. All right. In rare cases, we're doing it in attempts to kind of combat things that already got introduced elsewhere. So it's something that scientists are doing. But there's a lot of cautions when we do that to try and take care of something that's already here, that's invasive, by bringing in sort of maybe their native predator or something like that. Because it's very hard to predict what effects that will have on the ecosystem. And the biggest problem with these introduced species is the fact that they are in a new location, and so they aren't being kept in control by their native predators, their parasites, their pathogens. And so really these introduced species end up seeing huge exponential growth. All right, there's nothing there to keep them in check. And because there's nothing there to keep them under wraps, they're out competing sort of their native counterparts. All right. And so they'll be able to come in, out compete, because there's nothing else keeping them, their population in check, their numbers in check. And so they just take over. All right. And that can really be a big problem for their counterparts who are native, who are here, who do have natural predators, who do have natural parasites, so on and so forth. All right, and they just can't compete against this, and we end up losing diversity in that respect. Overharvesting has been a huge problem, particularly in the fishing communities. All right, where we're going out and we are taking plants, animals, aquatic organisms at such high rates because of our demand, typically because we eat them, and we're taking them at such an alarming rate that they're not able to recoup their own population size and keep their population size at a reasonable level, because we're taking the largest organisms, which are the ones at the reproductive age, and not allowing them to reproduce. Okay, and a lot of the organisms that we're taking out are bigger organisms that have a slower reproductive rate, and we're not giving them the time to reproduce to keep their population numbers at a reasonable level. Okay. And so we're at the risk of, if we continue pulling these organisms at the rates that we are, from causing them to go extinct because they don't have the time to keep their population numbers at a healthy, sustainable level. And then there's the global changes. All right, the alterations that things like our carbon emissions and other things that we're pumping into our atmosphere are shifting that chemistry in our atmosphere and having significant impacts, not just locally where we're actually causing that to happen, say a factory blowing all sorts of CO2 and nitrates and sulfuric acid and things like that into the atmosphere, but it's having effects kind of downwind. Acid precipitation, acid rain is a great example. We burn fossil fuels. This showed up in the 60s, but up here in Canada, and all of a sudden, it's not necessarily that immediate area that's being impacted, it's downwind from it. All right, and so that's a hard thing sometimes to convince businesses of, because they don't see the immediate effects of what they're doing, because it's not causing issues right there. It's causing issues downriver or downwind from their factories, and they are sort of burying their heads in the sand, if you will, saying, well, I don't see any effects here, it can't possibly be from me that acidic precipitation is causing issues hundreds of miles away. But it does. All right, and so acid rain's a big problem in killing the fish, killing off other lake-dwelling organisms as we continue to lower the pH of that. Air pollution. All right, so there's the example. All right, industrial pollutions in the Midwest causing acid rain in eastern Canada. We also had some kind of go the opposite direction. So there's a lot of stuff that's been put in place. The EPA was really designed to take care of a lot of this, but you go with something like the US and Canada, and now you're crossing international boundaries, and that politically makes all sorts of red tape. But the idea is to put regulations in place to help decrease this, to minimize the impacts, minimize what we're putting out there so that we're not causing as much global issues. So just the example, putting in some of those regulations with sulfur dioxide emissions. All right, we decreased it about 31% between 93 and 2002, and we're seeing the benefits of decreasing those emissions. Okay, so that's why when you or your parents have to go get your car inspected, it's no longer just sort of engine and brakes and tires, which was historically the case, but now you need that second sticker that says that your emissions coming out of your car's exhaust are within reasonable levels according to these newer environmental regulations. All right. But yet again, here's something where we need to really start pushing more and more for international regulations rather than just national ones, because places like India and China don't have the strict regulations that we do here. And so what they're doing is continuing to have a global effect on our climate. And although we're doing good things, trying to be more proactive here in the US, Europe's trying to be, certain countries in Europe are trying to be a bit more proactive. If it doesn't take hold as a globe, we're not going to see the effects that we really need to cause global change and positive global change. But that's a hard thing to convince for countries that are growing and trying to be more industrialized. Their argument is, how are we supposed to feed our people and advance ourselves in a global society if we can't do these things? And so one of the biggest things, if you spend any time really looking into conservation as a global thing, is reconciling the needs of those local people, the governments, the misconceptions that are out there. And a mark of a very good conservation scientist is to be able to talk to the general public and speak on their level and get them to understand why it's beneficial monetarily as well as environmentally for them, while also understanding the science. And that's a very hard thing to do while also wrangling in politicians